I did it.
Just to say, in case you don't know, the Energy Cohort is a peer learning group for affordable housing professionals interested in energy efficiency, renewable energy, resiliency, and resident health to network, learn, and share information. We welcome both nonprofit and for-profit affordable housing stakeholders to join us, and it's co-hosted by LISC Boston, New Ecology, and MassCEC. So we have some great speakers here and a great topic, but I think I will turn it over to Emily to talk about what the topic and who the speakers are. If you don't mind.
Great, thank you, Don. So again, I'm Emily Jones. I'm with LISC Boston, she, her pronouns. Thank you so much for joining us, taking the time. We're really excited. We had a 9-month hiatus from our energy cohort. And so we're getting back up to speed and gonna try this virtually. And we really welcome your feedback and input on how we can improve. And if you wanna, there's a lot of us here, so if you just wanna add in, rename yourself with your name and which organization you're from, also feel free to use the chat, the chat button to share some more information. And then what we're talking about today is the need for cooling, talking about extreme heat. We're going to hear from Lauren Baumann from New Ecology to speak about some of the issues and what I'm sure you're all experiencing with our summer on the ground here and what residents are experiencing in different properties across the state. And then we'll also have Bev Craig from Mass Clean Energy Center joining us, presenting on some of the different electrification strategies for cooling, why we are so interested in moving toward electrification and how that can really help solve some of these issues. We really look to all of you for your experiences with different cooling strategies. And so when we get to that part of the presentation, we'll ask that you put into the chat if you want to raise your hand or share on a specific experience. And I also just want to add that this is really something that came out of 9 months ago. And since then, some interest from this group on going deeper into cooling strategies and affordable cooling strategies, because we know that all electric heating and cooling can be quite expensive. So looking forward to sharing with you some of these different options and then really hearing your feedback. Again, as Don said, if you can just keep yourself muted while we go through the presentation, but then I think Lauren and Bev will just share when we want to start to have input. And then afterwards, we want to make sure that folks have, if there's new topics that we really want to prioritize for the next session, we plan on doing these quarterly virtually now. And so we would love to hear from you on what's of interest and where we want to dive deeper. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Lauren from New Ecology to kick us off and start the presentation. Thank you.
Sounds great. Thanks, Emily. I am going to start sharing my screen here. And maybe, Emily, you can just give me a thumbs up if you can see it and everything looks good. Great. Perfect. All right. Well, so nice to be here again with you all after this 9-month break and talking about a really important and timely issue. So as Emily was saying, there's a lot of interest in really gathering as a group and talking about these sort of dual climate issues of cooling and electrification. And so that's really why we titled our talk today here, Cooling and Electrifying Affordable Housing, Related Climate Resilience and Mitigation Challenges. And this talk really kind of gets to the heart of how we have to be both addressing these issues from a mitigation as well as a resilience perspective. All right. So the agenda for our discussion today, as Emily was saying, first and foremost, Bev and I are going to give a little bit of background and context around these issues. So I'm going to start first around extreme heat and temperature increases and some of the science and the data that's coming out and has been coming out on that over the last, 7 or 8 years, and what it's telling us. And Bev is going to jump in and talk more about electrification and why that is so extremely important right now as it relates to climate mitigation. And then a bulk of the conversation is really going to be diving into these cooling strategies. And so what we've done to start our conversation here today is just outline a handful of what we see as the sort of most typical common approaches to incorporating cooling into projects. And we've really taken the lens of existing buildings from this perspective. Not to say that some of what we're talking about isn't going to be relevant and interesting as it relates to new construction projects, but very much wanting to tackle this as an issue that you all are dealing with as it relates to your existing portfolios and how to deal with this. And so we're going to go through a bunch of strategies from really sort of simple and inexpensive to much more complex and potentially much more expensive and everywhere in between. And our goal is to really talk about the sort of challenges and benefits and pros and cons of each of those strategies, and then to really hear from you all about your experiences and impressions, if you have more to add from the perspective of the benefits and challenges to different strategies, or really just anecdote and stories around how this has worked for you and you've been addressing these issues. So, first and foremost, heat is a real public health issue, and it's been one that's been acknowledged for a long time. It's been the largest weather-related cause of death in the US. Since NOAA began reporting that data. But the good news is that it's something that is understandable and potentially preventable. And it's something that, the different groups around the country as well as locally are starting to grapple and really get their hands on as it relates to understanding how it's going to impact them. So here we've got some images from a report that the Union of Concerned Scientists issued recently. And this is more sort of the national perspective of what's happening as it relates to climate change and changes in temperatures and extreme heat. And so you'll see here, this is one of the ways that folks are representing some of this heat risk and challenge that we're going to be addressing across the country. And so the row to the left here is a map of the United States, and this is the historical heat challenges. And so on the top, what you're seeing is 90 plus days, areas that have been experiencing temperatures above 90 degrees. And then, if you look at the middle row here, what we're looking at is the sort of challenges that we're going to experience if there are no actions taken as it relates to mitigating our emissions and the impacts of climate change and sort of that change that's going to happen. On the right-hand side, you'll see here is slow action. And so that's really, if we're making incremental benefits or making incremental strides towards reducing our emissions, but we're still going to see impacts as it relates to the extremity of the heat that different areas of the country are going to face over time. And, we're concerned about those 90 plus degree days and extreme heat conditions, but we're extremely concerned about the ones that start to hit above 100 degrees. And those are the ones where we're really starting to grapple with severe risk from death from heat. So locally, in about 2015, Cambridge was really one of the local municipalities that led the charge around really understanding and starting to put together the building blocks for addressing extreme heat in their communities. So the climate change vulnerability assessment that they did back in 2015 looked at a variety of different factors as it relates to climate change and the impact that it's going to have on community heat. And they found a bunch of really interesting things. Here you can see the predictions that they created using global warming modeling and local weather station data, historical data, and then they use that to project forward into 2030s projections as well as 2070s projections. And from this bar graph here, you can see that the average mean temperature historically has been somewhere around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. But looking at the different emission scenarios, which is what you see in those different bar graphs for each of those different timeframes, there's fairly significant increases happening in the average mean temperature over time. This is also really sort of impactful. By 2030, the annual number of days over 90 degrees may triple. And by 2070, we're looking at potentially up to 6 times more days over 90 degrees. So a 6-fold increase. So that's a lot, but the thing that really drives this point home to me is if you take a look at the sort of calendarized information to the right-hand side here, the 1971 to 2000, that's our baseline. That's essentially the number of days that we have experienced both with 90 degree plus temperatures as well as 100 degree plus temperatures, so a little less than 2 weeks. And if you take those days and you string them together, you're essentially looking at a week and a half of those types of temperatures. But if you look at the projections that they've done based on the emission scenarios, the 2030 projection and the 2070 projection essentially are pushing us towards a summertime, a 3-month block almost, that will have temperatures that are all above that 90 degree threshold, many of which are gonna start to move into that 100+ degree threshold. So this is really important for a variety of reasons, because as you look at the morbidity associated with heat events, you know, our bodies can take extreme heat for short periods of times, and obviously there's variation in people's ability to do that, and that has to do with vulnerability. So elderly, children, other folks with medical conditions are going to have less tolerance, but generally the human body can handle extreme heat for short periods of time as long as it's given the ability to cool. But we get very nervous when we start to see these trends that result in essentially summers where we have very little, if any, opportunity for individuals to cool, because we're seeing these heat waves getting longer and longer and longer. And so that was mostly just temperature information. I think the other really important thing to think about here is the heat index. So this is the feels like temperature. This is the combination of relative humidity and temperature. And so if you take a look at that graph on the left-hand side, what we're looking at is significantly higher heat index numbers, summertime heat index numbers. So historically, somewhere around 85 degrees Fahrenheit has been that feels like temperature. If we look at the projections for 2030, we're up in the sort of mid-90s. And for 2070, depending on the emission scenarios we look at, we're either at slightly above 100 or close to 110. That's extremely important as it relates to impact on human health. Anything above 90 degrees, you tend to see folks who are outside working becoming more susceptible to heat-related illness. Anything above 100, vulnerable populations become extremely susceptible to heat-related illness. And then, you know, if you move above that, really anybody is going to be at risk of illness or death as a result of prolonged exposure. So Cambridge has done a fantastic job since 2015, you know, gathering this science and this data, and then really taking that and evaluating the scientific information about what the temperatures are likely to be across the city of Cambridge, and cross-referencing that with population vulnerability. And so what we're seeing is City of Cambridge and City of Boston starting to put together action plans for dealing with specifically neighborhoods that are at highest risk because of their physical attributes around things like heat island, but then also where there are populations that are most vulnerable. Here's some information, you know, quick on the heels of Cambridge's studies, the City of Boston began their work in really assessing vulnerability related to climate change. And again, heat became one of those issues where when folks started these studies, they were really much more focused on sea level rise and precipitation related flooding events. But I think what these studies did was really focus people's attention on heat and how heat is such an important piece of this that we have to be paying attention to and protecting people from. So the University of Maryland has this great tool on their website where they essentially allow you to select your city, and based on emission scenarios and projections, they'll tell you what the climate of that city is likely to be like in 2080. And so I think it's really pretty impactful to look at the fact that if you type in Boston, Massachusetts, even under low emissions scenarios, we're looking in 2080 at a climate that is more that of Maryland. And the reality is we're ill prepared for that. Historically, our buildings have not been designed with cooling in mind. And so many of our existing buildings have failing, if any, infrastructure around cooling, and it's going to become a major issue. The state of Massachusetts has also invested a lot in researching and sharing information around resilience, and they've got a great resilience hub on their webpage where folks can download maps and take a look at information at vulnerabilities. And here's two such maps that they have access to. The one on the right was really looking at temperature increases and vulnerable populations and really trying to highlight where in the state there are the most vulnerable populations as it relates to heat-related illness and death. The one on the left is really interesting because this was a study that was done by UC Berkeley, and they not only looked at the sort of science and data around temperature change and extreme heat and relative humidity, but they also incorporated into that study another factor related to building characteristics and whether or not a building has, or the building stock tends to have cooling. And so that's a really actually important point, and one that's been highlighted very recently in an article that came out in Science of the Total Environment. So this is a team of Harvard GSD as well as UC Berkeley scientists who essentially looked at these heat vulnerability studies that are being done by communities and identified that there's really sort of a deficiency in many of them, in that they're not specifically looking at building level determinants. And so, you know, as they started to study this and look at, you know, the level of the housing stock, its ability to cool in terms of mechanical systems and its just overall condition, that really gives a much truer picture of heat risk and vulnerability. So I think this study was a real strong nod to the fact that, you know, even though these are extreme heat situations that we're all going to have to deal with and grapple with, and they're very scary to see, that we actually have quite a lot of power in terms of protecting human life as it relates to how we deal with indoor environments and whether we can cool. You know, 50 to 85% of the deaths during extreme events are associated with indoor exposures. And so if we can figure out how to effectively cool these buildings, we can mitigate quite a lot of those. With that, I'll turn it over to Bev to talk a little bit about the electrification side of the conversation here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Beverly Craig. I work at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, and we are a quasi-state governmental agency. And the reason I'm speaking here is because we've had years of experience with heat pump rebates of every kind and have seen lots of different projects, both new construction and retrofit. And so that is one of the cooling strategies that we'll be talking about a little bit later. But I'm just going to talk a little bit about electrification and the push, why the state is pushing so much towards electrification. So we have a state goal now to have a net zero emissions target by 2050. And that really means we need to get fossil fuels out of our heating, and we need to make buildings a lot more efficient. And to just give you a sense of that, the scale of that, 27% of greenhouse gases in the state come from the fossil fuels in buildings. So buildings are about 40% of the overall emissions right now. But as our electricity grid gets greener and greener, we're at 60% renewables now, and every year it goes up 2%. And my guess is it's likely to go up much quicker than it's scheduled to right now, just because the cost of renewables has come down so much, and we have so much offshore wind planned that will be very low cost. As soon as that gets approved, those numbers of what's on the electric grid will change quite dramatically. But even so, assuming 100% renewable energy, you're still left with fossil fuels being 27% of the problem of greenhouse gases in the States. But by 2050, we got to change that. And of course, buildings are second after transportation, although I think things are moving along for electrification and transportation pretty well. Buildings are probably the toughest nut to crack in the overall greenhouse gas picture. And just for perspectives, we have around 2 million existing buildings, and you can see in the picture, we've got every shape and form, right? Like, it's not a cookie cutter approach for how you retrofit these buildings. We also expect around 500,000 new buildings by 2050. And actually the vast majority of those will be multifamily. Next slide. And so you might have been hearing a lot of talk about Brookline's ban on new gas hookups. And you may have heard that Arlington and Newton are having hearings around electrification requirements for new construction, and like 13 other communities are looking into that. And so what's the deal, right? Like, why is everybody thinking about this? So I think traditionally we've thought of natural gas as a transitional fuel, those of us who've been working in energy efficiency for a long time. And yes, it definitely does burn much cleaner than oil does when you actually burn it for heat. But when you start, what we're starting to realize now is that the extraction, especially with fracking and no controls on methane at fracking, and the distribution leaks, especially the Boston Metro distribution leaks, are quite dramatic. That the methane in natural gas is really contributing a great amount to climate change. So for perspective, methane's about 34 times more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of heating for climate. So it just doesn't take that much of it to make a really big difference. And there are great numbers about gas leakage. You can see everything from 1% to 9% of it being released. But that really is a big equivalency to other contributing factors towards greenhouse gases. And as we do get success in making electricity cleaner and cleaner, that's really the place that we're going to need to be pushing for our heating and cooling. Next slide. And so for just perspective, if you assume electricity becomes 100% clean by 2050, and building efficiency in all these 2.5 million buildings is about 35% more efficient, you go from the blue line, which is today's emissions, to the green. And you'll see natural gas, see the shaded area, that's because of the leaks that I was talking about for methane. So really, I mean, electric baseboard is not efficient at all, but when you do transfer to, it would be still very expensive to deal with. But any kind of heat pump, you can get down to zero. Next slide. And so new construction, I think, is changing really fast. It's very interesting. Just maybe 5 years ago, you wouldn't have seen very many new construction projects heating and cooling with all heat pumps, but that has transitioned very, very quickly. I did a recent presentation where I pulled 30 projects that I know of that are doing all heating and cooling with new construction with heat pumps. It's really becoming industry standard in multifamily in particular. So that's pretty much the slam dunk, is the new construction. And I think that's why you see these communities saying, let's stop digging a hole for ourselves. You don't want to invest these new buildings for 25, 30 years in natural gas. Let's try and get them as much electric as we possibly can. And luckily, the reason you see the transformation is with a good new construction envelope. So even stretch code, and certainly when you go to passive, you're not talking about higher operational costs necessarily in a big way. And the other thing is that even upfront construction costs, when you cost out the 5 or 6 different options you can have for heating and cooling, heat pumps usually show up in one of the 2 lowest cost options. Next slide. So as we get into the details of what different cooling strategies are, I would encourage you, well, I'm going to take off my MassCEC hat. First of all, I come from an affordable housing background, and I also am very active in Green Newton. And so I'm not speaking for MassCEC here, but it's really important that we all collectively look at policy changes that are happening and take advantage of those and push for policy changes that are going to help with this. And so 2 new developments that you may not be aware of, the MassSave Lean program. If you have an electrically heated building, they will actually, and the majority of tenants are low income, they will pay for retrofits to mini splits. You should definitely look into that. there are higher costs for changing filters. So on the maintenance side, you're going to have a slight bump in costs, but you will have a pretty big, if they're sized properly, change in your electric costs. And LEEN also has added a new measure. So if you've taken advantage of the LEEN program before for some of your buildings in the past, you know, they've evolved over time, but you can come back now for advanced air sealing in unit for free. And I would highly recommend that if you're looking at any kind of heat pump, actually any kind of new heating or cooling system, you want to get the air tightness down to reasonable levels. Most of our older buildings have terrible, terrible air infiltration problems. And so it is great that they're offering this. It actually has a big health impact. I would say this has a big, like Enterprise Green Communities on their turnover checklist really emphasizes air sealing. And the reason is because of pest management. You'll find that good air sealing from the inside is going to dramatically reduce your pest management costs as well. But then on the bigger policy side of things, right now, MassCEC and the LEEN program, they do a great job. They're #1 in energy efficiency in the nation. However, I think we all realize that the level of insulation and air sealing is fairly low. It's nothing like a deep energy retrofit. It's nothing like 35% that we're going to need to get all these buildings to be more efficient. And it certainly isn't helping with electrification. And so it is really important in the next 3-year plan that affordable housing advocates speak out about changing the goal of the MassCEC program to not just be about cost effectiveness, but to also be about the state's climate action goals. That's really the only place that you're going to ever get any help on the cooling side, is what I would say. And then the one other problem, if you are installing VRF, which is what a centralized heat pump system in Massachusetts right now, you're not allowed to sub-meter that and charge tenants for it. A lot of other states allow that. They basically consider it sub-metering of cooling as opposed to electricity, but they don't allow it here. And so that is a big issue. If you put in a central system for cooling and heating and you can't charge it back to the tenants, then they basically have free cooling. You guys know what's going to happen then, right? They're going to probably overuse it, and it's going to be quite expensive for you. And you do need to keep in mind, we have heating allowances in Massachusetts. We do not have cooling allowances. As we start getting more like Maryland's climate, you know, southern states do get cooling allowances through HUD, but we don't have them here. So that is something for people to keep their eyes on and make sure the federal government is aware that we're seeing the health impacts that we are. And I think we're going to get into the details now, right? Yes.
Yeah, so I think, Emily, any questions or comments from folks on the chat at this point?
So far, no questions, but we'll welcome people to provide, to put into the chat questions as they come up, and especially as we get into these different strategies that you'll be going through. So, yeah.
Sounds good. And so Bev really started some of this conversation around some of the factors related to adding cooling to existing affordable housing. You know, I think one of the things we hear oftentimes folks asking about is whether or not passive strategies to mitigating heat impacts on buildings are sufficient. And we're enormous fans of passive strategies around both heating and cooling. We're working on a lot of passive house projects. You know, I think we'd be the first ones to line up to help you all with figuring out how to retrofit your existing building to a passive house standard. But the reality is, as we look at the implications around extreme heat, the passive approaches can help a building navigate some of those extreme heat issues. They're not going to solve them. And you're fundamentally not going to change those sort of critical indoor conditions that lead to health-related illness and potentially death related to heat through addition of shading devices in most situations. And so the reality is we are looking at how to retrofit these buildings for mechanical cooling systems. You know, I think COVID-19 has added additional complexity to this. I'm really interested to hear about people's experiences from this summer. I know, you know, at the beginning of the summer, there was a lot of discussion around how to navigate making sure that people stayed safe during extreme heat events. You know, with COVID-19, common building and community cooling centers were now riskier places. And, you know, I believe Bar Foundation actually put about $700,000 out on the street to help affordable housing developers deal with cooling in their properties. My understanding is that a lot of that was being targeted towards some pretty immediate implementation of like window and portable type air conditioning units. But it is something that was considered this summer. So I'm interested to hear if anybody was able to leverage some of that BAR funding to bring cooling into their projects and other experiences around that. So how do we start to think about these cooling strategies? So Bev and I put together the attached table here, and this is really just a summary of each of the strategies that we're going to start to talk through and hope to get your feedback on. Really from sort of the most immediately implementable and least expensive strategies, all the way through some much more extensive strategies and much more expensive strategies that are typically more relevant and appropriate to projects where you're doing building rehabilitation, refinance, and have the opportunity to do some of what Bev was talking about in terms of improving the building envelope, the air sealing, and integrate new mechanical systems that can provide cooling to residents. And so here's just a summary, you know, in terms of those different strategies that we're going to talk to. And what we tried to do is also pull together some very ballpark pricing information. So some of this information came from my engineering team, who is doing ASHRAE level 2 audits quite a bit on existing buildings and helping people think about sort of ballpark pricing around some of these measures for integration. But, you know, again, starting at the very sort of straightforward implementation of a window AC system, all the way through these much more complex air source heat pump systems that can do not just cooling, but heating and cooling. And so start to accomplish some of the goals around electrification of heating systems that Bev was just talking about.
And Lauren, I'll just note that Andrew DeFranza is bringing up a good point about cost of all electric. So something that we can definitely cover as we move toward all electric. How do we pay for it and make sure that that, you know, we're being supported in the state's carbon goals?
Yeah, so that's a great point. And I think Bev, you know, addressed a couple of those things already as it relates to, you know, working, you know, to try and make the carbon neutrality goals part of the equation as it relates to how MassCEC thinks about their efficiency standards. And that could help with some of these strategies that are also electrification strategies and maybe could offset some of the cost associated with those. You know, I think there's potential for the costs here actually to, you know, what we've identified here is really sort of the capital costs of the actual system and the installation costs. I think, you know, one of the things I know Andrew's been grappling with on one of his projects is related to potential electrical service upgrade costs. And so that's variable among these different strategies as well. You know, if you're implementing window AC units, it's very likely that your building has the electrical capacity to be able to handle that. Obviously, it's not a given, but you'd need to look at each building in a case-to-case scenario. But for some of the more extensive electrification strategies where you're now taking the energy load that was previously being supported by natural gas and putting that on the electric utility, there could be upgrades that are required and need to be paid for associated with that too. So this is by no means comprehensive and exhaustive as it relates to the costs associated with this, but it's really much more meant to give people a sense of sort of the scale and relationship of the actual equipment and install costs between these options and the different levels of efficiency and how quickly they can be implemented.
Just to add on that, Andrew's point that sometimes you've got to upgrade as well. I would say the first two of these you can do without triggering the utility's attention. So if you're using these all only for cooling, the first two don't trigger the utility's attention. I'm not sure about PTACs, they may or may not, but mini splits and VRFs do. And that is where you sometimes get hit. I mean, my understanding, actually, I see Nate on this call who used to work at Eversource, so he might know even better, but I know Jane at HRI has been hit often. You basically have to pay for a lot of the resiliency requirements for the whole neighborhood to add these kinds of things, which is not really fair and not moving us in the right direction, in my opinion. So
All right, so let's start with that list and talk these through. So, I think everyone's very familiar with window AC units in terms of thinking about who bears the utility costs, the operating costs associated with those. Typically, it's on the tenant, unless you're in a situation where your building is master metered for electricity, and then obviously it would be an owner responsibility. And that obviously needs to be factored in as you think about the sort of capital cost as well as the operating costs of these different systems. One of the things that we see that can be challenging with window AC units is there's a lot of variation in the efficiency of these units based on their age. And so, what we're recommending at this point is that it's best if the building owner purchases and owns the equipment and is also responsible for the management and maintenance and installation of that equipment. So, in terms of the benefits, it's inexpensive. You can implement it immediately and get the sort of health benefits immediately associated with it. It's removable. It's non-intrusive to the building envelope, so you're using your existing window opening to incorporate the system. And Bev had a really good point on a call earlier today, is that with window AC units, typically you see individuals sort of taking on independently more behavioral zoning, especially if they're paying for the cooling themselves. So, if they're not in their bedrooms during the day, they turn the AC units off that are in their bedrooms during the day, they turn them on in the living spaces, and vice versa at night. So you tend to see a little bit more of that sort of positive behavioral feedback as it relates to sort of independently zoning the systems and only using them in spaces when those spaces are in use. I think some of the big challenges associated with these window AC units, obviously you need a single or double hung window typically to put a standard window air conditioning unit in. So if you've got casement windows or other window typologies, it's less available to you. We definitely see folks using portable AC units. Those are more expensive than the window units. And, in my experience, we've seen folks have variable results in terms of how effectively they're cooling spaces. But that is an option if you have a different window typology that doesn't accommodate a window unit. Installation is really important. Safety associated with installing these window units high above city streets with pedestrian walkways below. That's why we really recommend that the ownership and the maintenance team take responsibility for them. They're ugly. Nobody likes them. They look terrible in the windows. In the summertime, they need to be removed from the windows in the wintertime and stored. And storage is often a space premium issue. If they don't get removed during the winter time, then you have significant amounts of air infiltration and thermal bridging happening in your building. So you're increasing your heating load. And that's a real negative thing as well. So we really do want to make sure that there's a protocol and a space for taking those out and storing them. And, while you can put multiple units in multiple spaces and sort of distribute cooling that way, it's not a traditional ducted system that's sort of sending air and distributing and circulating it around those spaces really consistently. Any other thoughts on the window AC units?
Not from the chat.
All right, so a variation on the theme is the AC sleeve. So we see these in a lot of existing buildings where, they're pretty ugly, but they're essentially a hole cut through the building envelope adjacent to the window or other doors, and a sleeve is installed, and then a specific type of air conditioning unit is put into that sleeve. Again, the benefits are that it's inexpensive. You're not interfering with windows. The safety protocol around it is a little bit more straightforward. You can winterize these units with them in place. And so, making sure that you're infilling with foam and gasketing around them, but you can sort of store the unit in place, which helps a little bit with space. But you are, when you cut these holes in the building envelope, penetrating your air barrier and your insulation level layers, which is, again, going to result in additional heating load on the building. You do have to winterize them. They are also not pretty and have similar issues to the window AC units in terms of distribution potential. So, pretty much everything that cools is a heat pump. Your refrigerator is a heat pump. The idea being that it's a compressor and refrigerant-based cycle where you're essentially using refrigerant to transfer heat from one space to another. And in cooling mode, essentially you're pulling heat from the indoor environment and sending it outside. Some of the heat pumps that, or the newer generation of heat pumps that we're talking about that can also do heating are essentially able to reverse that cycle. So while your window air conditioner can't, some of these next options that we're talking about in terms of air source heat pumps can. They have valves that allow them to reverse their cycle and essentially be extracting heating energy from the outside air and bringing that into the space. And so a PTHP, I think folks are probably very familiar with the terminology around PTAC, those sort of hotel room type systems. We don't see a ton of them around here, but I wouldn't be surprised if folks on this call might have a building or two that has them in their portfolio. It's a packaged terminal air conditioning unit that's typically done heating and cooling. It essentially is a big penetration in the exterior envelope where you sit the system from the outside. It looks like a grill, so it doesn't penetrate out the same way that a sleeve does, but there is aesthetics implications to it. Typically, again, the cost of that utility is on the tenant to operate. It's on their electric bill at the unit level. And so the good news is that for folks who have properties that have PTAC systems in them, there is an upgrade option that can essentially use the same sort of space and approach of the current PTAC, and that is the packaged terminal heat pump. And so it's a more efficient version of that system that, is definitely more expensive than replacing it with a standard PTAC, but is also quite a bit more efficient from a heating and a cooling perspective. So that's something that should definitely be considered. And then most of the projects that we're talking about really figuring out how to electrify existing buildings are going to be thinking about that within the context of either mini split air source heat pumps or VRFs, which are the next two system types that we're going to spend a little time talking about. So the interesting thing is that the mini split air source heat pump, you can use it as a cooling only strategy. So if you were not in the market to sort of electrify your heating system for one reason or the other, but you did want a more sort of formal and efficient system in terms of cooling at your building, you could implement a cooling only mini split air source heat pump system. And so again, typically there's one outdoor unit to one indoor unit in this type of system. Typically, the outdoor unit is tied back to the electric meter at the apartment. So again, as long as the building isn't master metered, tenants are paying the utility for that. And people like this as compared to some of the earlier options because now you're just looking at a small refrigerant line penetration into the unit. So aesthetically, they're much more pleasing and they're less invasive to the building envelope. They're quite a bit more efficient than some of the other options. And then, in terms of challenges, if you have large buildings with many units, you do need to find a place to put these outdoor units. Typically, they get put on roofs or sort of patio areas. So depending on the typology of your building, you would need to find the space for those outdoor units. And ideally, what you want to do is minimize the length of the refrigerant run from that outdoor unit to the indoor unit. So it may mean that they're somewhat distributed around the outside of your building or up on the roof to try and enable you to do that. One of the challenges is putting these up on roofs is, especially as we look towards incorporation of solar into our projects, you're now eating up a lot of roof space that could otherwise be dedicated towards solar electric production. So that is one of the challenges. It is a much more significantly expensive intervention than some of the other strategies that we were talking about earlier. I think for cooling only, if you're doing one outdoor unit to one indoor unit, Bev and I were talking about this, and $3,500, $4,000 a unit, you can basically get that system. Where it starts to get a little bit more expensive is when we talk about using these mini split or multi-split air source heat pumps at the unit level to do both heating and cooling. And so if you remember back to the chart we were just looking at, that this was more in that sort of $6,000 to $8,000 per unit range. Here you're actually using that outdoor compressor in both of those cycles, the heating and the cooling cycle. Again, your tenant is paying for utility costs. So now that's not just cooling related, that's also heating related for your unit. And there's some interesting things that you can do when you implement mini split air source heat pumps into existing buildings. You know, there are potential challenges to that as well. But, you know, if you have a building where, for example, you have a central, let's say, hydronic system, and you want to integrate a mini split air source heat pump system where you can be doing cooling, but then also heating at the times of the year when outdoor temperatures are such that the system is running really efficiently. You can potentially come up with a hybrid approach where you use your air source heat pump in heating mode during those sort of shoulder season outdoor temperatures when it's most efficient to try and really reduce carbon, reduce cost, and then potentially transition to your fossil fuel-based existing system when outdoor temperatures drop really low and the efficiencies of these all-electric systems get to be less to try and mitigate some of the cost implications. And so we definitely see folks doing that. The word of caution there is you just have to do it with real carefulness around the control strategy to make sure that you are going to be prioritizing the right system at the right time to really optimize carbon and cost implications. It also becomes like super important when you're using these types of systems to be integrating some of those other energy conservation measures to mitigate your heating load. And so, you know, that I'm going to talk about a little bit, but it's critical. If you're going to implement one of these systems, you should make sure that you're really reducing that heating load as much as you possibly can through weatherization, insulation addition, those types of things.
And I will say, if you're interested in this approach, it works better for a gut rehab. So say you're taking a mill building and making it into affordable housing, you really do need to focus, especially, you're going to have very limited options for insulation in the walls there, but air infiltration is key. And I would say you really don't want to electrify for both heating and cooling in that kind of mill building unless you can get the air infiltration down to close to new construction levels. You do see it a lot, actually, both advanced air sealing and things like aero barrier being used these days to really make that air tightness much better. And then you're not going to see that the problem is if you have a lot of air leakage and you get to those very cold days, your heating costs can get very high. So the less air infiltration you have, the more shielded you are from those kinds of things. But if it's an occupied rehab, there's a lot more limitations around what you can do for air sealing and insulation. And so keep that in mind. Like, it may be that those properties where you're not going to be able to move people out are more appropriate for just a cooling approach with heat pumps and not, or a hybrid approach where you're using it in the shoulder seasons and then flipping on a fossil fuel system in the coldest months.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the other reasons that folks like these systems is that it is more sort of quote unquote residential scale equipment. So from a maintenance and replacement perspective, that can be a little bit more straightforward. You know, if you have one person's outdoor unit go down, that doesn't mean the entire building's heating and cooling is down. And so people like it from that perspective. I think some of the challenges we see, obviously, we're starting to get into the higher level of capital cost intensiveness. You know, I spoke a little bit about integration with existing heating system distribution and controls. One of the things, you know, we're starting to see a lot of these systems being implemented, and there's been a lot of really great research that's being done actually in the field to measure the performance of these systems. The performance of these systems is measured in what's called the COP, or a coefficient of performance. And so, you know, there's manufacturer stated coefficients of performance, and then there's what these systems are actually achieving in the field. And so there's been quite a lot of research on that in the last few years, and a lot of really good work done to identify situations where perhaps these systems aren't living up to their manufacturer rated coefficient of performance efficiencies and why. And so there's been a lot of good learning that's happened around how to mitigate those issues as it relates to system install and design and controls. So I think we're in a good place as it relates to that, but it's definitely something we need to pay attention to. And if you're thinking of implementing these systems in your properties, making sure you're working with somebody who really understands the issues, and an installer who understands the issues and is going to do a really good install for you. The other thing that you need to consider if you're going to use these systems for heating and cooling is that if we're running these systems in winter conditions, you do have to protect them from snow and freeze. And so, making sure that appropriate accessories are specified to lift these systems up above snow lines if you're up on the roof or even at the ground level, and proper freeze protection as you're running them. So to Bev's point, I did want to talk a little bit about the heat operating costs, because I think this is an extremely hot topic and it's an important one. Bev had mentioned in her discussion around it that one of the really critical pieces of implementing this type of system is trying to reduce your heating energy load as much as you possibly can, and I couldn't agree more. What I put up here on the screen is actually a simple calculator that New Ecology has developed to sort of look at the operating cost implications of conversion from a natural gas-based heating system to an air source heat pump-based heating system. And so at the top here, what you'll see are a set of assumptions. And so we've put in some assumptions around the cost of a therm of gas, as well as the cost of a kilowatt hour. This obviously varies across the state, so you're going to want to look at this specifically for your projects and your utility rates. But what I've put in here for this example is $1.20 a therm, about 24 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity. And then you put in some basic assumptions about the efficiencies of the two systems you're comparing. And so for heating system efficiency, we generally put in like about a 70% efficiency for that. And that's a combination of equipment as well as distribution system efficiency. And then for the air source heat pump, what I've assumed here is that we're going to get to that coefficient of performance or efficiency of 2. And that, I think, is a pretty reasonable assumption based on some of the research that we're seeing coming out of the field on some of these systems. And so you look at what your heating load is for your space. And so here what we've used is 700 therms. So if we were heating the space with natural gas, it was taking us 700 therms to do that in a heating season. And what we do is we convert that to kilowatt hours and then look at the implications as it relates to the efficiency of the electric system. And so you'll see that there's the conversion to kilowatt hours, and then there's a modification factor as it relates to the proposed COP, right? So that's the efficiency. And just to give a little context on that, electric baseboard heat is a coefficient of performance of 1. For every kilowatt you put in, you get 1 unit of energy of heating energy out the other side. These air source heat pump systems are much better than that, in that they're getting higher than 1. So here what we're saying is for each unit of energy we put in, we get 2 units of heating energy out. So assuming that COP of 2, to heat this property through, or this unit through natural gas, would be about $840 a heating season. To do that with electric heat, with like a baseboard electric heating system, would be about $3,500 a heating system. If we're using an electric heating system that has a coefficient of performance of 2, these types of air source heat pump systems, that brings that down to about a $1,700 implication. So the reality is here that, for this example, heating with electricity is going to be about 2 times more expensive than it would be to use natural gas. The context is that this is your heating energy budget, right? So when you think about your operating costs on a property, heating energy is one piece of it, but then there's all your other electrical costs, there's all your operations and maintenance costs. So that's actually something we've been really interested in learning from development organizations about is, when you look at your operating cost budget for a particular property, what percentage of that is actually your heating energy costs? And if you were going to do something like this, and let's say your heating energy cost goes up by 2, what percentage is that of your overall operating cost for a project? So that's a little plug I'm going to make for folks who are interested in talking through that with us, because it's something we want to understand a little better at this point. But at the end of the day, the reality is it costs more based on the dollar value of a therm of energy and the dollar value of a kilowatt energy to do this type of electrical heating, even if you're doing it with efficient air source heat pump systems. And so to Bev's point, the way you control that is by driving your heating energy load down. So making that 700 therms that you had pre-redevelopment or pre-retrofit, cutting that in half, cutting that by 1/3. And then you start to mitigate the impact of the cost of electrification.
But I will caveat that is very temporary right now. The gap between the price of gas and electric is not, like if many of you operate in other states, you don't see this kind of gap. If you're in DC, if you're even in other New England states, we have a very big gap between our gas price right now and our electric price. And I don't think this is gonna hold, honestly. I mean, I'm not gonna be in the crystal ball pricing. I don't think anyone should be, but we know there's $9 billion worth of infrastructure replacement for the leaking pipelines of gas in the Boston metro area. And I don't know about you, but my street has been torn up 5 times because I didn't get right any of the first 4 times. So I don't think it's going to be more than 9 billion is my guess. I don't know when an infrastructure project underground has been on target for cost. So that means at some point, like DPU has to decide how long they're going to stretch out the period that ratepayers pay that. But gas is going to get a lot more expensive. It will. And also electric's going to get a lot cheaper when offshore wind gets built. So hopefully that gap will not be permanent in Massachusetts. And certainly, like if things like carbon pricing happen, that will change this pricing too. But I mean, I think Lauren and I are totally in agreement that you should try and drive down your heating therms as much as possible. And this is really insignificant in new construction buildings because they're built so well, but this is a retrofit issue. This is definitely a retrofit issue. And that's why we mentioned these hybrid approaches where you'd, when air source heat pumps get less efficient, and that too is very dependent on going through those cold spells that we sometimes get. Once you get below 5 degrees, they get a lot less efficient. They'll certainly heat. It's not that they're not effective and that you won't have enough heat. It's that they won't be very efficient and they'll be expensive. And so it's when you get into that range that you want to flip. But also keep in mind, I don't know what our weather's going to be like in 10 years in the winter. It's a little hard to predict that too. So we could be seeing more polar vortexes, or maybe it's just generally a lot warmer like we've seen the last couple years. So always a lot of, you never know with this kind of stuff.
Well, and I think there's going to be a lot of interesting things that might happen. You know, as you said, like it's hard to know or predict what's going to happen with utility costs. But what I'm hoping is that there's going to be some interesting policy and potentially incentive type development around electrification that'll help support this. So if there is this sort of delta between natural gas and electrifying the sources here, maybe there's some other mechanism that helps fill that gap, right? And encourages people to make the right financial decision. So the last technology we wanted to talk about here is the VRF air source heat pump system. So this is also an air source heat pump system, but this is a centralized system. So instead of there being one outdoor unit for each indoor unit, we're talking about having a centralized plant essentially up on the roof where refrigerant lines run from that plant down towards indoor distribution systems. And so, very similar issues to the mini split and multi-split systems as it relates to the just basic technology. What we're seeing is typically these VRF systems do have higher coefficients of performance. The manufacturer's curves for them tend to be a little better than sort of the standard mini split and multi-split systems. We haven't yet seen a ton of field research done on the actual coefficient of performance that these systems are achieving, but it is something that's on the radar in the very near future for organizations like NEEP to really start to engage around doing field verification of those COPs. But generally, I think folks are assuming that these systems are achieving much higher coefficients of performance for a variety of reasons. But same drive to bring the heating energy load of these buildings down as you implement these types of systems. Typically in this scenario, you have the owner paying the utility costs to operate. And so Bev mentioned that a little bit before as it relates to one of the challenges actually. You would be paying heating energy in a system like this, which I think is pretty comparable to traditional sort of central heating mechanical plants, but you're also going to be paying cooling. And right now there is no allowance or way to be compensated for that. So hopefully more to see and hear about that as folks at the federal level start to realize this sort of change in climate and temperature in northern areas. There's also the potential for this system to incorporate what's called heat recovery. And it's essentially the ability, if you have spaces in a building that are in different modes, so one space is in a heating mode while another space is in a cooling mode, maybe because one has a northern exposure and one has a southern exposure, that the system essentially is smart enough to transfer heat and sort of take advantage of that heat, which helps with efficiency, but it does tend to be pretty expensive to implement. We typically see about a 30% increase in the cost of the system to do heat recovery versus a system that does not do simultaneous heating and cooling, is either in cooling mode or is in heating mode. So again, we get all the same benefits of electrification and carbon mitigation out of this type of system. You get one central plant, typically on your roof, that's doing heating and cooling. It's a more compact footprint than the mini splits typically are. So you're saving roof space for solar, which is a really good benefit as well. And typically, again, these systems are more professionally designed. The manufacturers are designed in the are involved in the design of the systems. And so typically there's sort of a greater level of confidence in the design and the installation of these systems and its ability to achieve performance. Again, the most expensive system we have here on the list. You know, you can also integrate this with existing heating system, but the controls component of it is really important and can be somewhat complex. You know, we're yet to see what the sort of realization of manufacturer COPs are. Still the same issues around snow and freeze protection, so needing to build these systems up high enough so that they're not sitting in snow. And similar issues, you know, I think if we were to convert that sort of equation that we had looked at earlier to higher COPs, then we would see less increase from the electrification associated with that. So that is what we expect with these VRF type systems. One of the caveats here that you have to be careful about with any of these refrigerant-based systems, though, is that refrigerant leakage is actually a major contributor to climate change as well. And so making sure that the systems are being designed and installed well is really really important. We hear these horror stories of these systems, you know, being charged improperly and leaking their full charge before they find the leak and then are able to seal it up. And so you can actually undo quite a lot of the potential benefit you're trying to create from a carbon mitigation standpoint if you're not very, very careful around the refrigerant component of these systems.
And it is really important that you commission those systems at the beginning. I think the vast majority of the leakage that we see is right at the beginning. So it's not that they don't need their annual maintenance, they do, absolutely. And when you see like national figures or even worldwide figures about refrigerant leakage, it's not so much from this kind of coolant. A lot of it is grocery stores are the big offender, actually.
So there are also other flavors of heat pump based electric heating and cooling. You know, we're seeing more and more interest on the new construction side around air to water VRF systems as a way of mitigating and reducing the amount of refrigerant that some of these systems are using and still maintaining efficiency. Ground source heat pumps are also sort of gaining traction, at least sort of in the conversation around electrification. You know, our experience has been that, you know, it's still expensive on the capital side to drill the wells that you would need for this, but extremely efficient systems from the perspective of their just overall electrical use as well as their carbon implications. All right, I think that's what we had for the full presentation here. Emily, you've been very quiet. Are there any comments or questions?
Thank you so much. That was great. So Michaela, I think from Worcester Common Ground CDC, wanted to learn a little more about the LEAN, the mini split, the subsidy program from the LEAN program.
Yeah, sure. MassCEC actually funded a pilot of 67 retrofits of electrically heated to mini splits to demonstrate to MassSave and the LEAN program that it was cost effective. They found it was very cost effective, and so now they cover that as a free measure under the LEAN program. So if you have electrically heated and you're interested in getting mini splits, you just need to apply to the LEAN program. There's an online portal where you put properties in. If you have more than one, I would recommend a portfolio approach. Feel free to reach out to me. I've done that a bunch of times, especially if you have like a variety of big and small properties, sometimes that's an easier way for them to handle you.
Great. And then Nate from POA had a question about the Wi-Fi based controls on AC window units or the AC sleeve units for common areas or owner paid resident AC units, if anybody had experience, good or bad.
I can't say I've had direct experience around that.
And I don't think anyone asked, but window sleeve units, I know when I was at homeowners rehab, and I don't know if Jane's still on or not, but they did do a number of covers on a number of their projects, and I don't actually know how that turned out. Like, it's always good at refinance to try and add that if you have through wall sleeves. I know in those properties, they did end up buying the AC units themselves. We found over time from the initial installation that people replaced them with their own of varying sizes, which often led to terrible air infiltration. So the property definitely found it useful to buy ones that fit and sort of control those and then have the covers installed every winter. But I don't know, like 3 or 4 years out, whether the covers disappeared or whether they actually made any impact.
And just one more question from Donna at South Boston, NDC, whether there's any rebates for changing buildings with electric baseboard heat to mini splits.
So yes, if you have any buildings that are electric baseboard heat, LISC will pay for free mini splits to those buildings. Because electric baseboard heat, if you design it properly and you actually have like certainly 1-to-1, so one indoor unit to a compressor outside, if they're smaller units, you can get the COPs of 3 that the manufacturers promise. Where we're seeing lower COPs, it's like more like 2 is often when there's multiple heads on one compressor. But yeah, they'll pay for that. And so you just need to apply to the LISC program. And like I said, just reach out to me if not. Sure. So my email, well, I think, why don't we send out, will we send out a follow-up email, Emily?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, please reach out to me. If you have not fully tapped the LISC program for everything you possibly can, or you want to get back to them for this advanced air sealing on the interior because they haven't done that before, please reach out to me. I used to work at homeowners rehab for 12 years, and I know them very well, and I know how to work it. And get things like a lot of people don't think to ask for variable speed drives on their pumps, for example, which is an electric measure, which can really make a big difference sometimes in bigger buildings, especially. So there's things like that, tricks, and you know, I'm not a big fan of gas, but if you have an old dying gas boiler that's atmospheric, they do install a condensing boiler as well.
Thank you, Bev, and thank you, Lauren. This has been great. So I think what we'll do is we're coming up on the 4:15 hours, the witching hours. So thank you all. I think, Dawn, we're thinking about quarterly meetings. So likely look for, I think early December is probably likely. But between now and then, we'll be sending out the slides from this, and I think we'll try to get the recording on a YouTube link to share with folks as well. If you have colleagues or others who might have missed today's event, we'll share our contact information. And then we would love to hear additional, what kind of you're focused on, what you want some of our next topics to be. We want to make sure these are as interactive as possible as well. We know we're all getting used to the Zoom life. So just any feedback you have, we'll take that, and I think we'll send that out in the version of a short survey, like a Google form after this. So thank you again, and we really appreciate your time, and please reach out to us if you have any questions or feedback. Anything else to add, Don?
No, other than just to thanks to everybody for joining, and thank you to Lauren and Bev for great presentations. That's it.
Great. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
And maybe the 4 of us want to stay on for a minute. Looks like Bev left, which is fine. I guess I want to just check on, hold on, just copying what's in the chat.
And then Don, you can probably stop the recording.
Okay, so which I do by pause recording.